Perdition. The very word evokes imagery of hellfire and damnation. Certainly, if you are in perdition, hellfire and damnation might very well describe your life here on earth, psychologically speaking. But what actually is perdition? What you are about to watch is a technical presentation on perdition. We will explore what perdition is, how perdition works, the consequences of living in perdition, and how to get out of perdition. There is truth to the idea that perdition is associated with hell and damnation. Its actual manifestation, however, is much more mundane than religions would have you believe. Still, the effects can be dire. Perdition means by or through the rule. Existing dictionary definitions claim it is an archaic word meaning utter destruction and is synonymous with loss and hell. The dictionaries capture the eventual consequence of the consciousness of the human who lives in perdition, but the meaning itself is incorrect. Per means by or through. Dition means rule. Therefore, perdition is by or through the rule. Perdition describes the manner in which a being acts. Is the being self-guided or is it not? Is it following its conscience or is it not? Is it following the dictates of another or is it not? Perdition describes a relationship between a being and that being's rightness part. One who is in perdition has their rightness part disabled. As a result, they must refer to something else to know what to do and what not to do when they act. That something else could be a human, an alien, a deity, some tablets, a book, a scroll, God, or a thought. Perdition is a crutch, a state of being that one uses when they cannot think for themselves. In today's world, the most common form of perdition relates to statutes that guide the conduct of citizens of all the countries. They are called acts because they tell you how you should act. Why do you need to be told how to act? Because you do not know how to act on your own. Why is that? Because your rightness part is broken, for one. Your ability to think for yourself is severely compromised for another. And thirdly, because you have not been taught the proper way. Here is what life is like for someone in perdition. Everything they do and every decision they make must be checked against some higher authority before it is made. The reason this is so is because the consciousness, or subconscious in this case, has been reprogrammed to check that authority instead of its own conscience for the rightness or wrongness of the action. The rightness part is effectively shut down, and the functions that would go to it are deferred to the authority. That authority is a thought. The form of the thought can differ, but they all have the function of determining what is right or wrong for their subjects. Whether the authority says, this is right or this is wrong, the message is then communicated to the reason part instead of the feeling part. The perdition soul will try to justify their actions to make them feel at peace with them. Thus, reason now communicates to feeling that it is okay to do the wrong thing. Feeling and desire then work with the body to act on the wrong instruction. In a worse state, a victim of perdition's desires are not to reason for themselves, but to satisfy that authority. Thus, desire does not even communicate with reason where it normally would, and instead is focused on the authority via their compromised rightness part. They want to do what the authority tells them to do. They do not want to do anything else. They do not want to think for themselves. They do not want to take responsibility for themselves. They are afraid of their own judgment. Doing what the authority tells them to do makes them feel good and justified, though those feelings are wrong and improper. As Percival says, they are governed from without. Someone in perdition cannot grow. Their thoughts are not able to run through the thought life cycle if they even have thoughts of their own. Because they cannot grow, the end result of perdition is that they become an automaton to be used by and disposed of by the authority as it sees fit. The victim of perdition is not even aware of this capacity, however. They only thrill at serving it and doing what it tells them to do, or not doing what it tells them not to do. They will commit great acts of depravity and wrongness towards their fellow men and not think twice because they cannot think at all. In popular culture in the year 2017, zombies are all the rage. Zombies are monsters who were formerly human. They are mindless, brain eating automatons. Zombies are an unconscious manifestation of the inability of the average human to think for themselves because the average human lives in perdition. Zombies are a mirror for pernicious humans. Thought binding is the technical term for mind control. It refers to a very specific act of mental violence, which is the willful subjugation of a consciousness to an idea. In the Foundations in Consciousness video, we observed that everything has their place in the universe, and that you have faculties that can interact with each of those things at their appropriate layer in the universe. You interact with physical things using your body and senses. You interact with psychic things using your emotions and will. You interact with mental things using your reasoning mind and rightness part. And you interact with noetic things using your sense of identity and self. Nowhere in this process do you use things in one category to interact with things in another category. We introduced the idea of a thought as having a structure in accordance with the law of opposites, and also that thoughts follow a life cycle. We also learned that humans attach to thoughts in order to think and learn about themselves. And finally, we saw how self-respect was necessary in order to protect our boundaries and thus our proper thinking process. We have not yet looked at damage on this channel, but briefly I will mention that the concept of damage is what happens when our thinking process is disabled in various ways. The results of damage are what we call physical, psychic, mental, and noetic disorders. Damage is really nothing more than a waste of time, and it is possible to live a better life when we do not have to deal with damage. The way to do that is by living healthily in all its various aspects. Perdition means by or through the rule. The word is 3 syllables long, but the last syllable, ion, means state, and so it is not drawn in the tracking. We therefore have 2 syllables with 3 thoughts between them. Thought A is the rule. It may be a code, it may be a religious dictate, it may be a statute or rule of law, or it could even be whatever someone else tells you. Thought C is the thing following the rule. Thought B is the medium through which the rule is referenced, such as a book. The idea always takes precedence over the physical object. We could track even further back as someone had to make the idea and they had motivations. As we know, all thoughts follow an aim. If you take the place of thought C, you will follow the aim of thought A, thus the tracking is subservient, but also you will follow the motivations of whoever made that thought. What were their motivations? It might be that those motivations were less than pure, let's say, and given how terrible the thinking in general is on this planet, that is highly likely. We have also already seen that when you are in perdition, taking the place of thought C, you defer to thought A for your knowledge of what to do and what not to do. You do this by making an appeal to authority via thought B. For example, the Bible says, or the law says, which is a logical fallacy and in particular, a fallacy that bypasses your rightness part, which inhibits your thought and adaptation processes, as proven by Percival and Peterson, respectively. The damage to your being as a result of being placed in perdition is severe. Moreover, perdition will invariably conflict with your conscience. For example, that which is right may be illegal, and that which is wrong may very well be legal. That which is right may be forbidden by your church, while that which is wrong may be allowed and encouraged. For example, let's say there is a police officer in an authoritative regime who has a friend who is to be put to death for the crime of political dissent. The death is to be carried out by shooting, and the police officer is to take part. If the police officer fails to take part, he will have a problem with his associates and may himself become their enemy. If the police officer proceeds, he will have killed his friend. How do you resolve this situation? Typically, the police officer will violate his conscience in order to follow the rule of his country, with his country being described by a thought, such as a constitution or a declaration or all the laws and acts on the books. He will commit an immoral act by killing his friend, and he will damage himself by furthering his perdition. This is a lose-lose scenario, and it happens anytime a human is bound to a thought. Heroically, the police officer may be able to rescue his friend by turning on his associates. He will undoubtedly exile himself and his friend in the process, and may even have killed some associates. In a world which has been completely explored, it may also be that there is nowhere left to go. The scenario can best be described as win-lose, but also has a lose-lose potential. Perdition is a necessary consequence of thought binding. Perdition is a necessary consequence of mind control. You cannot place someone in mind control or thought binding without also placing them in perdition and damaging them. It is because of that damage and the harm that would be done to them, as we have seen, that mind control and thought binding are considered to be acts of violence against the victim. Mind control is the act of subjecting a human to a thought's aim, usually involuntarily. You might at first think of mind control as a crazy concept from science fiction that requires a highly technological device to accomplish. This could not be further from the truth. A simple lie can suffice for establishing mind control. So can simple misunderstandings and errors in thinking. Frequently in human history, people find new ways of life that are foreign to them growing up. The West discovers the East, and the East discovers the West, and each thinks the best parts of each other's culture are better than the worst parts of their own. And so they make the mistake of discarding their own culture to totally adopt the others. The mind control begins at this point in the form of cultural programming because the human did not think about what they were doing. Perhaps a famous example of mind control in action, and certainly one of the most shocking, is King John's concession of England and Ireland to the Pope in 1213 AD. He wrote to the Pope, "John, by the grace of God, King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, Count of Anjou, to all the faithful of Christ who shall look upon this present charter, greeting. We wish it be known to all of you, through this our charter, furnished with our seal, that inasmuch as we had offended in many ways God and our mother, the Holy Church, and in consequence are known to have very much needed the divine mercy, and cannot offer anything worthy of making due satisfaction to God and to the Church, unless we humiliate ourselves and our kingdoms, we, wishing to humiliate ourselves for him who humiliated himself for us unto death, the grace of the Holy Spirit inspiring, not induced by force or compelled by fear, but of our own good and spontaneous will, and by the common counsel of our barons, do offer and freely concede to God and his holy apostles, Peter and Paul, and to our mother, the Holy Roman Church, and to our Lord Pope Innocent, and to his Catholic successors, the whole kingdom of England and the whole kingdom of Ireland, with all their rights and appurtenances, for the remission of our own sins and of those of our whole race, as well as for living as for the dead." and now receiving and holding them as it were a vassal from God and the Roman Church, in the presence of that prudent man Pandulph, subdeacon, and of the household of the Lord Pope, we perform and swear fealty for them to him, our aforesaid Lord Pope Innocent, and his Catholic successors in the Roman Church, according to the form appended. And in the presence of the Lord Pope, if we shall be able to come before him, we shall do liege homage to him, binding our successors and our heirs to our wife forever, in similar manner to perform fealty and show homage to him who shall be chief pontiff at that time, and to the Roman Church without demur. As a sign, moreover, of this our own, we will and establish perpetual obligation and concession, we will establish that from the proper and the special revenues of our aforesaid kingdoms, for all the service and customs which we ought to render for them, saving in all things the penny of St. Peter, the Roman Church shall receive yearly 1,000 marks sterling, namely at the feast of St. Michael 500 marks, and at the Easter 500 marks, 700, namely, for the kingdom of England, and 300 for the kingdom of Ireland, saving to us and our heirs our rights, liberties, and regalia, all of which things, as they have been described above, we wish to have perpetually valid and firm, and we bind ourselves and our successors not to act counter to them. And if we or any of our successors shall presume to attempt this, whoever he be, unless being duly warned he come to his kingdom and his senses, he shall lose his right to the kingdom, and this charter of our obligation and concession shall always remain firm. What you just heard is a successful conquest of England by the Roman Catholic Church using the technique of mind control. King John had the duty of leading his people, and whatever drama was going on at the time, he dealt with it by handing his people over to their enemy. Let us look at this letter line by line to show just how much damage mind control can do. John, by the grace of God, to all the faithful of Christ. We have established that God has two primary and simultaneous meanings. It either means you in your entirety or all the laws of the universe in their entirety. An error in thinking occurs when people use it in the sense of an ultimate owner of the universe that can influence events in the universe. That is not how God works. We live in what is known as the free will universe. In this universe, you are free to make whatever choices you like. Eventually, you will figure out where to take your evolution when you tire of this universe, which ultimately comes down to a choice. That choice is made by programming certain habits in the general pattern of your life. The free will universe is a reality in its own right and operates by certain laws. The laws apply to everyone and everything in the universe. At no time will those laws deviate for anyone under any circumstances, because to do so introduces a violation of the law of free will. Let us suppose that this universe is held in the mind of a larger being. They set up this universe to be a free will universe. If they were to suddenly influence events for some preference or outcome, then they will have removed the possibility of choice for their inhabitants of their universe. The trauma this would cause upon its inhabitants would cause great harm to their psyches, identities, and being, for it is a violation akin to soul rape. They would not be able to evolve. The universe itself would likely not last long, as everyone would flee it the first chance they get, and then have a stern word with its creator. This is also the reason why there will never be a situation where God smites thee. To hold a universe in your mind so that others may enter and enjoy it and learn from it is a potential evolutionary path for a consciousness. It requires mastery of morality to such a degree that you can guarantee you will not cause harm to your guests. As for faithful of Christ, this has to do with belief. Belief is not the same as knowledge. You derive growth from knowing what to do and what not to do about a topic. Belief is nothing more than an idea or hypothesis to be tested. In some cases, it is an assumption, but you should test it out to verify whether it is true or not. If it is true, then it is added to your knowledge set. If it is not true, then it is discarded. You open yourself up to errors in thinking if you proceed on a belief that turns out not to be true. That, inasmuch as we had offended our Mother, the Holy Church, and needed the divine mercy and cannot offer anything worthy, unless we humiliate ourselves and our kingdoms. The Holy Church is not the mother of the people of England and Ireland. It did not make them. Neither they nor you have any need for divine mercy, and I refer you to my comments about the free will universe and why a supposed creator being cannot influence events by offering mercy or being vengeful or wrathful. There is also never a time when it is appropriate for a human to humiliate themselves, for that betrays a lack of self respect and can only result in damage. For the kingdom, it betrays a lack of self respect for the people as a whole, and especially for its sovereign. We, wishing to humiliate ourselves for him who humiliated himself for us unto death, the grace of the Holy Spirit inspiring, not induced by force or compelled by fear, but of our own good and spontaneous will and by the common counsel of our barons. The him who humiliated himself for us unto death part is part of the mind control program. Whether such an event did or did not happen is irrelevant. What has happened since is that the event is used as a narrative to further an agenda of world domination. This agenda is successful as long as the people believe it, and thus he who owns the agenda can gain control of a country's population. Think of it as a mass attachment. It has an aim, and you do not need it. The Holy Spirit refers to the mental parts of your being. I am not sure the writer knew that. The lack of force and fear may or may not be true. There was a lot of drama surrounding this letter. King John acted cowardly in writing the letter and did not have any conception of recognizing a mind control program working on his people and rescuing them from it, which would have been his responsibility, by the way. An act of spontaneous will is not something proper for a king. Decisions must be thought out thoroughly with the consequences well understood as much as possible. It seems more likely that this letter was an act of self-serving interest rather than what is best for the good of his people. Do offer and freely concede to God and to our Lord Pope Innocent and his Catholic successors the whole kingdom of England and the whole kingdom of Ireland with all their rights and appurtenances. He gave the Pope his kingdom for free. It is not just the kingdoms of England and Ireland that were given, but everything they create, such as their future colonies, all ultimately being owned by the Pope. For the remission of our own sins, and for those of our whole race, as well for the living as for the dead. A sin is an aim in the wrong direction. It has its origin in hunting to say that someone who had missed their mark had sinned. The king is trying to undo his people's sins by making another sin. It is also not his place to bind the living or even the dead. Binding our successors and our heirs by our wife forever, in similar manner to perform fealty and show homage to him who shall be chief pontiff at that time, and to the Roman Church without demur. Religions and their churches, nations, empires, and corporations are all the same thing, a thought. They all manifest in a certain way and people attach to them. Because of this thought dynamic, they are all essentially the same thing. You can think of corporations and religions as nations and empires in their own right, and if you think about that, you can see the pattern. It is all ultimately a grouping of people in constant communication with each other about a topic that they treasure and try to bring forth into the world. They often make the mistake of forcing others to think the way they do. That is actually the thought's influence, because when thoughts get to a certain size, they tend to take on a life of their own. In order to maintain their existence, they must keep people attached to them. So when the king started believing in Christianity, it is as though the thought of Christianity had control over him, and it was possible for it to get a whole lot more people attached. The king bound his successors to the church to keep the dominance going for all time. As we see, the Roman Church and the Pope is the one controlling this thought. As a sign, moreover, of this our own, we will and establish perpetual obligation and concession. The Roman Church shall receive yearly 1,000 marks sterling for the kingdom of England, saving to us and our heirs our rights, liberties, and regalia. The king, having given his kingdom to the Pope, is now renting back his crown. The church does not have a military force of its own. The way it conquers is by influencing the minds of people. Catholicism is not the only religion that does this. Any religion that has a core tenet to spread itself will do so by mind controlling a population whose lands it intends to invade. And we bind ourselves and our successors not to act counter to them. Anytime the word bind is used with respect to human actions, there is mind control going on. Here we have the king binding his people and his successors, trying to establish control over their minds, not to act counter to his letter. No king should bind his own people, for it violates their free will. Circumstances are constantly changing in this universe, and people need to make decisions that are appropriate to them at that time and place, keeping in mind their thought and adaptation process. Bindings arrest their decision making to the point that the right decision might not be able to be made. A king should encourage adaptation, not thwart it. Reifications are about taking thoughts and treating them as though they were physical objects. They are about making something that is supposed to be abstract, real, or concrete. Perhaps they can even be about attempting to bring something into being, such as with summoning a spirit or necromancy. According to Black's law, reification is the mental conversion of an abstract concept into a material thing. All of these uses are a logical fallacy known as the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. When you see the words material and concrete, they are synonyms for physical, which is the word we have been using for the same concept. Here is a visual depiction of a reification. All it is treating a thought, which is a mental construct, as though it were a physical object. You cannot see, hear, smell, taste, nor touch a thought. Therefore, it does not exist in the physical universe. It exists in the mental universe. The thought's exteriorization will exist in the physical universe, but that is a different concept from the thought itself. It is an error in thinking to treat a thought as though it were a physical object. Treat a thought as though it were a thought, and treat the physical object in the manner that is proper to it. It is very easy to make this mistake. Consider how often people refer to their person rather than their body or their self. The former is a reification, while both of the latter are proper. When you work with concepts, you need to be very sure that you distinguish between a concept and the physical thing. Examples of thoughts that have been reified include companies, corporations, nations, militaries, countries, religions, some groups, organizations, charities, legal entities, contracts, agreements, NGOs, public service, societies, and so forth. Anything with a name that is itself not a physical object, but to which you are held or can control you, is an example of a reified thought and an improper use of your mind. As how you think affects what you do, if you make an error involving reification, then it is as though you have taken someone's bait and are now being led down a path they control. This is especially true if they made the concept that you are using in error. Consider trying to find a friend in a hall of mirrors as an example. Every mirror that shows an image of your friend is representing a reified concept. It is not real. You cannot interact with that image of your friend in the mirror like you would if your friend was standing next to you. Now, if you see a bunch of images of your friend and your friend is also there amongst them, then it is possible to figure out which is real and what is fake as long as you are able to differentiate your real friend from the fakes. This is the difficulty in identifying reifications in the real world because it generally does not work unless you know what to look for. To avoid the trap of reifications requires understanding thoughts or concepts and knowing the difference between thoughts and physical objects. Knowledge of the thought life cycle is also very important. When reifications are used in casual conversation, it is usually a result of sloppy thinking. When reifications are used as a manipulation tactic, it is a very underhanded, sneaky, and stealthy thing to do. At no time should a mental conversion between a thought and a thing be performed. It is improper thinking. Be aware. Thought binding is the specific act of binding a human to a thought. To be more specific, it is the act of arresting someone's thought process to defer to a thought whenever they need to make a decision. This action necessarily, consequently, and automatically places them in perdition. It is also possible for a human to voluntarily bind themselves to a thought as a result of their own will or lack of thinking. Such actions are done whenever they take up a new religion, join a new company, join a new country, or take up any cause in service of a value. All are thoughts to which they attach, but they do so in a way that overrides their thinking. When thought binding occurs, it is usually backed by some sort of force to keep the binding in place. In the religious example, the force is social exclusion or excommunication. In the case of a company, the force is the loss of one's employment or livelihood. In the case of a country, it can be jail, deportation, or death. It should be noted that there are also times the above occur that have nothing to do with thought binding. Sometimes someone behaving unacceptably necessitates their exclusion. Thought binding is often reinforced with manipulative and deceptive practices. In the religious case, confession, for example, does not and cannot absolve one of their sins, but it does provide the church with valuable intelligence data. In the company case, the fact that you need to work just to survive is leveraged for the benefit of the company. In the country case, the citizens are thought to be free, yet they are bound by the laws of their country and given no instruction on how to properly own their freedom. In every case, there is deception by those who run things against those who serve. There is a relation between knowledge and responsibility in that whenever someone has the knowledge, they have the responsibility to preserve it, get it out there, and see that its distribution benefits civilization somehow. You will find in every thought binding case that this responsibility is ignored. Thought binding is an inherently harmful process because it results in perdition. Due to this nature, it is considered a violent action to bind someone to a thought. Forcing people to join a religion, to join a company, or to join a country are all acts of violence upon those people. Laying a trap in such a way, perhaps a honeypot, that people voluntarily join with the thoughts that the orchestrators know are harmful is also considered violent. If you subscribe to any ideology, you have bound yourself to a thought. A quick litmus test is, did I create this thought? If not, beware. You never want to be in a situation where some thought overrides your conscience. If it does, you are in a thought binding relationship. Thought binding is the root mechanism of your enslavement, for it places the thought in control of you instead of yourself. Anytime there is a controlling relation to a human, that human is not free. Thought binding a human is not only a violent act of enslavement, it is a massive demonstration of disrespect to that which is human. The human is meant to be independent and free so that the intelligent entity inside it, that is, you, can grow and advance. Recall that thoughts have a life cycle. If you are bound to a thought, you will be subject to its life cycle. On its positive side, things will be great for you and they may even help you flourish, but it comes at the cost of the persecuted who will be angry at you, and the thought will persecute. When the thought advances to the negative side of its life cycle, it will be your turn to be persecuted as terrorism or subversion advances on your country or religion and your fellow citizens or worshippers are killed off. Then the thought dies. Some people may recognize this concept as karma, but really, it is just understanding how the tools of your own mind work. This planet is full of people who do not know how to use their own minds. To get out of a thought binding relationship, one would have to break agreements, sever contracts, give up their citizenship, and leave their religion. Such actions are easier said than done. You first have to grow stronger, take responsibility for yourself, operate as an independent and free thinking human, develop your thinking skills, develop your mind, and then, when the environment allows, the binding thoughts fall away as you starve them of your work. Understand that when you are on the receiving end of such a relationship, you are being manipulated and controlled, so be cautious. A world without thought binding operates very, very differently from the world we live in today. The first and second commandments of the Ten Commandments are about thought binding. The first commandment says, I am the Lord your God, and you shall have no other gods before me. When the Bible refers to God, it is referring to you. This commandment is telling you to own yourself. As the first and most important commandment, that even makes sense, for it is one of the tenets of self-respect, and you know what happens if and when self-respect is ever betrayed. Think of it in terms of property, as shown in the tracking. It is proper and right that you are in control of your mind. In that scenario, you create your thoughts. The second commandment says, You shall not make unto thee any graven image. Another word for a graven image is a thought, because it refers to an imaginary image. This is the reverse direction of the first commandment, and that can be seen by taking the reverse direction of property as applied to your mind. Now you can see that a thought, or a graven image, is in the controlling position of yourself. Thus, you would have made a graven image unto thee if you did this. Perdition necessarily results. The relationship between the part of you that knows right from wrong and the part of you that feels is your conscience. You do not always feel when something is right, but you will definitely feel if something is wrong when your conscience is working correctly. If your conscience is not working correctly, you will not feel when something you do or witness is wrong. As a result of the lack of feeling, those who have a broken conscience must rely excessively on their ability to reason in order to work through a situation. This can tip them off balance into a very logical mindset, which may or may not work out for them. Worse, without their ability to receive information from their rightness part, those in this situation must yield to something else to know what is right or wrong. The word for this condition is perdition, which means by or through the rule. If we were to look up perdition in a dictionary, we get strange and religiously influenced definitions such as utter destruction and eternal damnation. Such definitions describe the end result of this state, but do not accurately account for its cause. Someone living in perdition will never truly grow beyond what the thing they are using for right and wrong states unless they learn to think for themselves and get out of its control. To be able to think for yourselves, they will have to get in touch with their conscience and feel it. There is another consequence of a loss of conscience, which is called sociopathy, which is a consistent condition of antisocial behavior. Generally, where antisocial behavior is concerned is that it is behavior that can harm someone else in some way. This behavior could be stealing or manipulation or power games or anything else that could prevent someone else from growing. The reason this behavior exists is because the thing that would hold it back, the conscience, is not working. There is no feeling of wrongness that says this action that one is engaged in is harmful and wrong. It is important to keep our thoughts, feelings, and actions in alignment. When they fall out of alignment for whatever reason, we are said to be off balance. Typically, we respond to events based on how we feel about them, which in turn is based on our knowledge of the subject. It is our rightness part contacting us through feeling that guides us here. In turn, we calibrate our desire to how we feel about the subject and proceed to do the right thing. When we are off balance, this process does not happen harmoniously or at all. An off-balance person will attach themselves to an idea and fervently pursue it. As we saw in the discussion about attachments, this can have both positive and negative effects and can be used for both good or ill. We all have to become off balance temporarily in order to learn. However, it can become problematic when the direction is reversed and desire operates to satisfy feeling. Ever know someone who is addicted to sex or drugs? When there is a significant number of very off balance people in an area, things in that area can become very problematic for human development, and it is on this function that tyrannies are built. Perdition and the state of being off balance go hand in hand. Both are caused by a loss of alignment. Both are caused by a loss of control. Both result in zealotry. The means are different, but the end result is the same: someone who suffers from mind control. Damage to this area prevents desire from removing the satisfying feeling of being in one's preference. Thinking becomes simplistic and one dimensional because it defers to their attachment for rightness. If you have ever seen someone who appears as though they are not there or perhaps soulless, this is a good symptom of damage to this part of their being. When we think, we validate our reasoning with what we know to be right, based on our accumulated knowledge at the time. Damage to this area means we are not able to validate our reasoning. This is also a part of perdition, where the emotional side had us off balance, the mental side has us unable to validate. We must trust blindly in something to guide us and essentially hope for the best. Some people call this faith. I call it infantilism. When damage to this area is present, you necessarily act like a child. You do not know how to approach a situation because you do not know the right way and the wrong way to handle it. You do not know how to take responsibility for yourself because, again, you do not know the right and wrong way of handling responsibility. Necessarily, you must default or defer to something else to get your rightness information from, because the thought process is always a repeating cycle, and that part must be present somehow. When it is not present in you, it is present in something else, which is like a mental form of codependency. A common type of person who exhibits damage to their mental acuity is a religious fundamentalist. Mental acuity is another term for how sharp and able is a person's mind. A religious fundamentalist is someone who operates solely on the words of their religious book. They exhibit no ability to think about, beyond, or around what the words in the book say. They oftentimes exhibit pride and vindication whenever situations result that align with the words in their book. Their book might very well be correct, actually, but their thinking ability is so damaged that the words become caricatures of themselves because their meaning has been lost. Meaning requires understanding. To understand something means to be able to break it down to its component parts and reconstruct it in your own words. It is on this principle that we figure out how things work. Mental acuity is required to perform this task. Someone who has sufficient knowledge of a subject and a working mental acuity can look at the words in any book and understand what the words are really talking about, the context in which they are appropriate, the right and wrong to address the topic, and how to incorporate that possibly new information into their life going forward. People with damaged mental acuity cannot perform the above. They are thus underdeveloped mentally in much the same way as a child is physically. They require proper guidance for their mind, just like what is done for their body by their parent growing up. It is actually the parent's duty to properly prepare their children mentally for the world, but this is sadly neglected in today's world. There is a concept called the age of reason or the age of discernment. It is that age when one learns to judge and comprehend the consequences of their actions, no matter how subtle. It is used in the legal industry to determine how responsible one is for himself or herself. It is about coming out of mental infantilism and taking care of one's own mind, just like one takes care of their body. Most of the time, the age of reason or discernment is understood to be achieved during one's teenage years. That is only true on the presumption that the child was raised correctly, but as is obviously true in today's world, many children are not raised correctly. Some people may not achieve the age of reason or discernment until they are 40 years old. Some, unfortunately most, will never achieve it in their lifetimes. The legal system has been identified as a control system to gain silent acquiescence from the people. Constitutional documents grant limited rights for citizens and contain persons non compos mentis. Let us take a closer look at how nations are formed with the support of this control system. One or a group of people band together and say, "We are going to form the nation of Happy Land for the people." The thought of Happy Land is created by that person or persons. In the case of one person, it is a monarchy. In the case of a group, it is an oligarchy. Either way, it is a founder in control of a thought. The legal system will recognize the thought of Happy Land as a legal entity and the founder as its owner. It will recognize Happy Land as the property of its owner. And this is all true and correct. Nothing wrong has happened yet. Now, the founder or founders need to get the people to join their nation as citizens. Perhaps the nation has a land or territory, and there are a bunch of people already in that land that is claimed by the founders for Happy Land. The founders, being wealthy, will be able to hire a military to secure that land and say to the people, "You have helped build this wonderful nation of Happy Land. This land, these waters, these mountains, these people, all of this is Happy Land, and it is all yours." What the founders are doing with those statements is creating a reification. They are taking their thought of Happy Land and saying it is the land, the waters, the mountains, and the people, which are physical things. This is not true. Happy Land is a thought created by the founders and exists in mental space. The physical land, waters, mountains, and people all existed before Happy Land even came into conception. They cannot possibly be a part of Happy Land if they existed before Happy Land. Happy Land can lay claim to the land, waters, mountains, and people, but only if the people buy into it. At a technical level, the people attach themselves to the thought of Happy Land and form a mass attachment with it. This gives Happy Land, as a thought, the power it needs to live hundreds of years and run through its life cycle in accordance with the law of thought. It will have an ascendant trajectory filled with good times and a descendant trajectory filled with bad times as the thought comes to the end of its life. At a more ignorant level, the people agree to be citizens of Happy Land and abide by its rules. They pledge their allegiance and bind themselves to the nation. This simple act of creating a nation results in automatic perdition for all of the citizens. Their thinking becomes clouded by the dictates and statutes of the sovereigns, and later their representatives. Eventually, there comes a point where the nation holds back the people from their ability to grow. They will be forced to do something wrong by their legal system. Those in charge of the nation want to keep their place, so they force things to manifest by using greater control. This is the beginnings of a tyranny. The legal system understands thought binding, but in a confused way. We look at the concept of attorn, the root of attorneys and attornments. To attorn means to agree to be the tenant of a new landlord or to transfer something to another. A citizen pledging allegiance to Happy Land is agreeing to be a tenant of Happy Land. He must live by the rules that his landlord sets forth. We may also look at it as if he is transferring control of his conscience to Happy Land, because the statutes of Happy Land determine what to do and what not to do. The function of what to do and what not to do is strictly the purview of conscience, and the substitution of this is what causes perdition. To become a citizen is automatically to turn away from our natural operation and transfer control of ourselves to another, the sovereigns of our nation, who control us by means of the unconscious entity that is their thought of the nation. You must learn to separate the concept of something from its application. As an aside, a concept can be defined as a specific arrangement of thoughts and their relations to each other. Transferring something from one to another is the concept of attornment. Agreeing to be a tenant or the landlord is an application of the concept of attornment. Agreeing to be a citizen of someone else's nation is also an application of the concept of attornment. The damage from these acts results in alienation from oneself. It is very easy to identify with something or anything when you do not know who or what you are. Often, citizens will identify with their nation as happy landians. This is the root cause of patriotism. We see similar effects in religions with zealots and fundamentalists, and in corporations with company men and women. All are thoughts, and all are governed by the law of thought. The only way at present to get out of this situation is to form your own nation. Be the founder or among the founders, and be in a position of ownership and control over the nation. The nation will support and protect you, and you will not be bound by its rules, thus escaping perdition, although you will have to enslave a populace as citizens. This has been the motive of everyone who has ever pursued self determination, so that they may get out from under tyranny and live truly free. Those pursuing self determination are recognized as internationally protected persons under United Nations Resolutions 2625 and 3166. These are protocols agreed upon by member nations in order to protect heads of state and their ambassadors. If you actually create your own nation, you would be a head of state yourself and can take your seat as an equal among the family of nations. To get there requires a great amount of autonomy, character, and responsibility, all of which I hope you have learned the importance of by now. The path of self determination is necessary, but the manner in which it is currently done, of recruiting like minded founders and citizens, ultimately places the citizens in perdition. The founders are at risk as well if they maintain too much rigidity with how to be in the world. The latter scenario results in the paradox of the philosopher king, where a ruler who knows how everybody ought to be enforces it and thereby causes a tyranny. I believe there is a way to build a nation and avoid the eventual onslaught of perdition by mastering and applying the law of thought at the national level. Animal Farm is a short novel written by George Orwell. It tells the story of a group of farm animals who rebel against their farmer, who is human. They do this because they want to be free and create a society where everyone can be equal, free, and happy. They pursue their own self determination. But their rebellion is betrayed, and their society ends up as bad as it was before, this time under the dictatorship of a pig. Animal Farm is allegorical to the path of self determination. It shows you what currently happens when you come out of tyranny, form up your own nation, only to create an eventual tyranny again down the road. Humanity has not solved the problem of cyclical tyrannies because it does not understand the forces at play. Albert Einstein said that you cannot solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. You must learn to see the world anew. We need to advance our thinking up to a whole new level and gain a bigger picture of how to run civilizations in order to solve this problem. The mental domain is concerned with how we think. A mental crime is any willful and violent act that causes damage to how a being thinks. Mental crimes are not concerned with what a being knows, they are related to how the thinking process is corrupted. Inflicting perdition is the largest mental crime that can exist. Perdition damages and disables the conscience of the victims such that they must refer to something else to know right from wrong. Those who have been taught to think by a book, statute, text, or any other thing instead of their own conscience and judgment are victims of this crime and have all taken severe damage. The damage is a corrupted thinking model that breaks the conscience and results in antisocial behavior, such as sociopathy. The damage is extreme when they act as fundamentalists with fervor or are unable to comprehend a world existing outside of their chosen text or beliefs. The perpetrators are he or she who willfully teach their victims to think in this way by the book rather than by their judgment. The crime of inflicting perdition highlights the need to teach thinking properly to one's children, apprentices, students, and citizens, and so forth. The crime catches cult leaders, popes, priests, imams, rabbis, gurus. It can apply to heads of state, teachers, and anyone else who would benefit from corrupting the thinking of the impressionable. The noetic domain is concerned with what we know. A noetic crime is any willful and violent act that causes damage to what a being knows. Noetic crimes are concerned with the corruption of knowledge of the victims. Corruption of a being's knowledge is severe damage because knowledge affects how the being thinks, how it feels, what it desires, and ultimately what it does. The knowledge set a being possesses, whether true or false, determines what it does with its life. An animal poorly trained cannot survive in the wild and therefore cannot be free. A human poorly trained cannot survive in civilization or the wild and therefore cannot be free. It is imperative that a society train its human properly in order to have a free population. Noetic crimes are those carried out by individuals that injure a society's ability to train its people properly. Mind control is the largest noetic crime that can exist. The beliefs inherent in the victim influencing his or her actions lead to actions that are injurious to the victim and his or her society. Sufferers of mind control have carried out many heinous acts, including suicide bombings, mass shootings, and other mass murders, genocides, leading cults, indoctrinating students, inflicting perdition via religions, gang rapes, and riots. Each of these initial acts have harmed numerous secondary victims. It does not matter how mind control is inflicted. It can be through repetition, torture, brainwashing, drugs, psychological trauma, mind splitting, psychological operations, or even through technological means. Simple things such as broadcasting lies as truth or passing an opinion as fact, such as with fake news, would also constitute mind control for the end result of transmitting erroneous knowledge for the purpose of gaining control over another human is still achieved. The intent is what gives mind control its severity. It must be done with the intent of gaining control over another by means of affecting what they know or think they know. Intent distinguishes mind control as crime from accidental situations, such as unintentionally relaying a lie or erroneously believing someone's wrong opinion. The crime of mind control catches intelligence agencies and their assets, religious institutions, heads of state and political operatives, journalists, and other agent provocateurs, and anyone else who intentionally sets other people down a path away from the truth. Indoctrination is the process of teaching ideology to people and preventing them from thinking critically about it. Perdition covers the mental part of indoctrination. The noetic part is again concerned with the information itself and its wrongness, which is forced to be accepted as right. Thus, those who are indoctrinated suffer damage due to the possibilities their installed beliefs prevent them from investigating. Victims end up living a life on a tangent that does not serve them, and they do not even know it. They also suffer damage due to the loss of time spent while pursuing the indoctrinated agenda. Time is a resource we all have that is valuable, and the theft of another's time via indoctrination is another crime in and of itself. Indoctrination is a form of mind control, and both are systemic. However, where mind control is more deliberate and will have special avenues where it is carried out, indoctrination can sometimes be accidental and will often occur in public common areas such as schools, churches, and city squares. Teachers and politicians, especially, must be very careful not to indoctrinate their people, or they will be caught by this crime for steering people away from natural law. Forcible thought binding is a crime against humanity because it results in perdition. It results in a situation that eventually places law against conscience, and that block prevents the growth of the individual, which harms them. It occurs every time someone makes an oath or swears an allegiance to their country. It occurs every time someone makes an agreement and is held to that agreement. It occurs every time someone is indoctrinated into a religion, cult, or movement. Left alone, it will eventually destabilize societies as people need to grow beyond the rightness and wrongness of the laws of their country. How did we get to this state? A combination of cunning desires for power allied with the best of intentions. Humanity obviously knows the word perdition, for it has reasonably correct consequences in its religious connotations, but present day humans do not fully appreciate or understand its implications. I cannot fault them for things they do not know. The way out of this mess must show people how to build a society that does not result in perdition, which means avoiding the traps of oaths, agreements, and indoctrinations. When you can clearly see two systems side by side, your current system that results in perdition and a new one that does not, then you will clearly understand why perdition is such an important issue and why it is a crime against humanity. Perdition is a mental and noetic crime. It is mental because it affects how we think. It is noetic because it affects what we know. It is a crime because it results in harm. It is not the only mental and noetic crime, but it is the biggest. Perdition affects entire civilizations and is the mechanism by which planetary tyrannies are made. All perditions require mind control, which is another mental and noetic crime. The deliberate arrest of another's mind for any reason is a harmful act that prevents their growth by preventing their autonomy. Mind control results in significant psychological damage to those suffering from it and harms society through the mind controlled actions that they make. Errors in thinking, such as reifications, can be considered mental and noetic crimes if they are taken seriously enough. The harm here is that we are dealing with something imaginary, but treating it as though it were actually real. It can lead to the belief that it is actually real and thus cause harm to people's thinking ability and knowledge. The concepts of persons, corporations, appearances, and other idols fall into this category. For thousands of years, these concepts and techniques have plagued humanity and kept it in bondage. They were used by religions, by businesses, and systems of governance. The legal system evolved out of this to keep the peace and make business predictable from those who would scam and commit acts of violence. The architects of the legal system engaged in the biggest violence of all by monopolizing force and threatening any who would try to stop them and their backward reasoning. They enslaved entire peoples under the guise of protection, corrupted their own members by placing them in perdition via the bar, and conjured backdoor loopholes that allow those who run the system to profit at the expense of others. In the name of keeping the peace, they kept natural selection at bay, which would have naturally culled them for their wrongdoing. The test of reason is not, what would a reasonable person do? It is, what is right? For reason is intimately linked with rightness as part of our thinking process, and no action that is reasonable will be wrong, and all right actions will be reasonable. There is not ever a situation where a reasonable action to achieve some aim conflicts with conscience. If there is ever such a conflict, conscience wins, and the course of events and thinking that lead to that point must be examined. To proceed with the aim by tempering conscience, as the legal system has done, begets a course of events that harms the people involved, firstly by violence, causing self-betrayal, secondly by mind control, and thirdly by perdition. It is the continual pursuit along this course that results in the repeating cycles of history, because the lesson that is to be learned here is not learned. Thus, humanity is stuck and cannot grow. Finally, the monopolization of violence results in a great theft of lessons to be learned for the people in self-defense, restraint, strength of character, morality, and honor. It breeds a population that does not know any better and results in mass corruption, mobocracy, widespread looting, and genocide. We are at the end of this presentation on perdition. Now you know, at a technical level, what perdition is, how perdition works, and the consequences of living in perdition. What do we do about it, and how do we get out of it? The answer is not easy. Perdition results from fundamental constructs in how societies have been built. Human laws have been written in ignorance of the law of thought, and therefore the psychological, mental, and noetic damage that results from their expression is unknown. It is unlikely that existing societies can reconstruct themselves in such a way that the possibilities that create perdition no longer exist. A new society is needed. Here at Trienia, we are building a new society that is designed so that its people do not fall into perdition. Education, culture, how we structure ourselves legally, and our very leadership are going to be so different from anything this planet has seen. That change is necessary to move forward. We can't keep doing the same old thing in a different flavor. What can you do in the short term? Make sure you know yourself. Make sure you know the real laws of our reality and be able to differentiate from human law. Make sure you can recognize when coming into contact with certain human endeavors can or will injure you. Make sure you know what you're involved in. Make sure you know self-respect, morality, and honor. Make sure you can walk the path of peace in all its forms, and to be clear, that does not mean being a wimp. Be strong and stand your ground. Thank you for spending an hour of your time watching this video. I hope you found the topic informative, enlightening, and maybe even a bit disturbing and controversial. Certainly, I hope you found that this gave you something worthy to think about. Feel free to leave a comment below if you like. I would like to hear your feedback. Perdition. It means by or through the rule. It is what happens when your conscience is disabled and overridden by an external authority. It stops your thinking and adaptation process and prevents you from growing. It will put your life in damnation and burn it to the ground.